Ready to win the battle for your team's attention? Build a digital collection of professional development titles to keep your people learning, growing, and productive with Overdrive. Drive performance, engagement, and culture with Overdrive. Learn more at company.overdrive.com/corporate-libraries.
Welcome to the Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Matt Beane. He is an assistant professor in the Technology Management Department at UC Santa Barbara and the author of the new book, The Skill Code: How to Save Human Ability in an Age of Intelligent Machines. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's a nice return to my roots, actually, because I came up through the L&D industry before going back to school.
Oh, yay. Well, that's going to be an awesome place for us to start our conversation. We are going to talk about the skill code, what that means, how we can work with intelligent machines to augment learning, which I'm sure all of our audience wants to know as AI is rampant everywhere, ubiquitous, and not deter our learning. And we'll explore that topic shortly. But first, let's talk about your origin story. How did you land in your current role? And can you share something that was accidental in your journey?
Many accidental moments. In fact, I sort of have a habit of progressing through accidental collision. I'd say probably the one that was career defining, that led to this arc of my career that I'm in now, that people know me for the last, say, 12, 13 years of my life, is that before my PhD program, I was a partner in a small consulting firm that specialized in helping groups to develop capacity for group dynamics related issues and also helped intervene in groups to improve their group dynamics. Typically at the executive level, although I would say, depending on which way the wind blew, some years it was, say, 70% working with HR, OD, L&D type professionals to upskill them so that they could serve their internal clients on these kind of things. Somewhere around 2006, in the midst of that kind of work and working with executive teams, I saw the advent of the smartphone and the BlackBerry, basically, like when it became really common. That pretty profoundly and very quickly changed the way that groups functioned, their dynamics, especially around conflict and touchy conversations and so on. That moment, I just couldn't not pay attention to and started to read a lot to try to learn about, how is technology changing the way we do work, basically. And I've always been a learning nerd. I mean, both my parents are teachers. And so how people learned, what people could learn was sort of a topic of professional conversation in my house growing up. And so that was one of the questions I had was, how do we learn what we learn to do our jobs now because of all this stuff? And I was in a firm before that did a lot of e-learning back when it was called e-learning, like online courseware and stuff. So it felt like a bunch of forces were conspiring. Because I paid attention to that started a whole jag of me reading books about what was happening with technology and where it was headed. I ended up reading books like Ray Kurzweil's The Singularity is Near, like a lot of folks did, and of course took it with a grain of salt. But really, it seemed like undeniable that at least some of that stuff was likely to turn out to be true. And that meant the world that we all took for granted back in 2005, 2006 was in for a heck of a change compared to what we were used to. Like the internet was going to seem like small potatoes compared to where we were going. And so then I started to volunteer as a research affiliate for Ray Kurzweil's research organization. I cold called them and said, I want to help. And my wife one day said to me, this is all you talk about. Technology is going to change, AI, robots, all the rest of it. You should just apply to school. She was starting a business of her own at the time. I was a partner in a consulting firm. And I said, now's a terrible time for me to do that. What are you talking about? And she's an executive coach by training. She was a therapist before that. She gave me one of these looks and goes, when's a better time? And so I'm like, okay, I'll take the GREs and I'll apply. I hoped very much to go do it. I really did. But in part of my brain, I thought, I'm not. Why would they? This is weird. Like, this is a mid-career pivot. And then MIT let me in. And we both looked at each other and went, okay. In the end, of course, it wasn't accidental. Like none of that bit at the end was accidental, but it was just sort of following a string of interest and clues until really it became unaccidental at the moment my wife said, when's a better time? That was like, okay, now this has to get serious kind of thing. But it feels like a sort of accident of history that I had the good fortune to come across that material at that time, have that work encounter with that technology and seeing it change group diet, all that.
Well, thank goodness for your wife encouraging a mid-career pivot and chasing after some of these interests that were converging all together to help create this new pathway for you. That's awesome. I always love that we get to start off our podcast talking about folks' career path, because I know we could talk about it for like 3 hours and still
Totally.
not get through it all, but it's led to this awesome book, which feels couldn't be more relevant. It's like you were looking into the future, the timing with AI right now. So maybe a good place to start is just defining what you mean by skill code. I definitely am excited to unpack that, but then get to what's the big deal with technology and how does that all fit in with each other? I know we'll get to this too. When you were breaking down Challenge, that chapter, I was just like, for anyone who's a science of learning nerd, they're recognizing all the research that you're referring to. So totally loved that chapter.
I am one of those nerds. Like that. This has been my jam my whole life, really. I mean, I start the first chapter talking about being obsessed with how people developed skill since I was like, 8. Not really understanding that that's something you could nerd out on until much later, but that's sort of been an obsession. The entire effort for the book, in a way, I didn't understand what I was doing at the time or why. This is all looking back at it and making sense out of it. So I don't want to make it sound like I had this grand plan, but I did have an impulse. A lot of people, after I published my original research on robotic surgery, that was about the implications of AI-enabled robots for skill development, but also making some pretty bold claims about what we were liable to see for the broader world of work. People who were really paying attention said, so where else is this happening? And what is it that... Nobody said it in exactly this way. They would have saved me 2.5 years of messing around. But what are these people who are finding a way to learn in conditions that are very hostile to learning? They're finding a way anyway. What are they fighting to protect? They're doing some stuff that's different, and their tactics are interesting. We can learn from their tactics. But what's more valuable to know is, what are those tactics protecting that all of us need to learn? And that's what the skill code is. So that took me about 2 years in the writing of the book to look across all my own research, all the research that I'm familiar with from other folks who are doing original research about new technologies and how they're getting adopted at work. And as you say, all the research on anything to do with how humans build capability, from education to sociology, kinesiology, even neuroscience, lots of different fields. What do they all agree about? If there is something that they all agree about around how we build the ability to do something reliably under pressure, which is my definition for skill. Different than knowledge. We can know a lot of things conceptually and not be able to, under duress, in conditions of uncertainty, just do the thing reliably. That's skill. That, I think, took me looking back across all that work over 13 years, plus spending huge amounts of time going through lots of different literatures I'd never really, really carefully read before to pull it all together. And to put a fine point on it, the skill code is 3 sort of atomic units of interaction at work, possibly not at work, but I focus on work, that need to be in healthy form in order for you to build skill well, or for any of us. Challenge is the first one. That's the one you just mentioned. Then there's complexity and connection, 3 C's. Complexity being maybe the one that's least familiar to folks or legible. It was to me, it was an important journey to sort of understand that we think of skill as getting good at something, like a skill that you do, when in fact, healthy progress towards even that focal skill involves learning proximate things, like looking left, looking right, understanding the broader system of work you're embedded in. Why does it work the way that it does? That kind of thing, because that helps you understand the system you're embedded in. And when somebody can reliably do something under pressure, it's because they're ready for surprises that come from 2 to 3 causes away. And that means you have some skill in complementary areas, not just your area. So there's engaging with the complexity bit. And then the last bit is about bonds of trust and respect between human beings. We treat that as somehow divorced from how we build skill when in fact it is the only way that we could ever do it. And some people say, oh, I'm an autodidact. I've never met another human being, let alone relied on them to build skill. And I can prove to them that's false. That's a fun conversation. And there are some people who do a lot of self-tutoring, but A, they got their material from somewhere. And B, they got their goals from someone. They're embedded in a social system that taught them what's right and wrong, true, not true. So those human relationships supplied them with even like what's worth going after. But for most normal human beings, we want trust and respect. We want to earn it. We want to give it. That's where our motivation comes from. So that was a really precious and fun part of that book to sort of pull together to write about, because we've somehow managed to convince ourselves that we build skill and the meaningful human connections that we have are just disconnected from that. And it's just false.
So I want to jump to kind of unpacking each one a little bit. As I mentioned before, like I had so much fun reading the challenge chapter because you're talking about desirable difficulties. I was like in your brain, I think, or I knew where you were going because I started to Google, like, wait a minute, zone of proximal development. I feel like he's going to talk about that, but this isn't going in chronological order. And I think it would have come before this, like text difficulty and matching it to prior knowledge. So I just loved that whole chapter for sure. It's interesting that you say complexity, and here I am already bouncing. But for the complexity one was, as you said, maybe felt less familiar. It felt like a mix of different things. And my background is cognitive psychology. So that's my prior knowledge. So I'm seeing a mix of, okay, visualization and sort of like scheduling of feedback in there, power of mental rehearsal and spacing effect, the nuance that you can find when you have that. But I really liked that aspect of you can't see the forest from the trees theme there that you get ideally when you're developing a skill, which kind of fell under this complexity bucket. So I wanted to ask, what does it look like to create a space that has healthy challenge or healthy complexity and healthy connection? And we can kind of talk about them all together, or we can do them one at a time, because there's going to be, you have like a handy checklist at the end. And by the way, I haven't mentioned yet, reading this book is going to be such a treat for folks because it's storytelling. You just use lots of different stories, different people to share some of the research, but in a way that is going to be memorable, of course, following all the signs of learning rules. Then at the end, start to package it in this actionable way. Our folks who are listening and are going to be familiar with, yes, I know that we need to create challenge, but what does that kind of maintenance process or auditing process look like in my organization right now?
I'm confident we're going to cover all of these things in exactly the right way. And it's going to be brilliant because they're all interconnected, right? So we can wander around. We'll be fine. I think key thing to say is that for each of those 3 C's in the first third of the book, I summarized the research. And yes, as you say, those stories are of real people. I've changed their names and a little bit of identifying information, but they are research informants from my own studies, and they are representative of the average person in that context, or a typical person. In other words, it's not just journalism. This is like systematic data across multiple companies, different kinds of technology, and so on. And that I'm drawing their story up as an exemplar. This is how we do qualitative inductive research. As long as you have saturation of a bunch of examples that are plausibly independent across lots of different contexts, you have a generalizable phenomenon on your hands. But that's, to me, part of what's fun about this. Is a total like tangent on your tangent, but like qualitative research, when it's done really well, you have a great story in front of you, but you're also very confident that it represents a real phenomenon in the world. It's not just a single inspirational or weird case. So in the case of challenge anyway, and complexity and connection, at the end of each of those chapters, I offer a 10-point checklist that gives you clear signifiers as to what you would need to go looking for to find out the extent to which you have healthy challenge, complexity, and connection, all of which, if you want to maximize the quality, of your skill development, you're going to need all three of those. Can you get skill without all three of those being in perfect form? Of course, but at least gives you a mental framework to go and look at your reality and decide. On the challenge front, I'll just maybe give a couple for each one of these just as a taster, but for challenge, for instance, the research on this is very clear, and desirable difficulties is one of the sources of literature that somebody who has more of a psychological orientation is going to be familiar with, but there are different names for this from different disciplines. In short, you're going to be learning best when you are uncomfortable, performing worse than you could, and totally focused. All three of those things. In the operating room, for instance, when I was studying this, these are the people who are almost uninterruptible because they are utterly focused on operating properly. And they're not frozen, they're moving, but it's like if you're really engrossed in a book, you really just won't hear somebody saying, do you want that burnt toast or not? That's how these folks are. And when they get out of the console, there's a control console for these surgical robots they were learning to use where their head rests in a 3D vision apparatus so that they can get a stereoscopic view inside the patient. They take their face out of that thing and it's sweaty. They're stressed out and they are not satisfied that they were doing their very best work. Now, I know that kind of sounds scary for a surgical patient. Trust me, they're not making errors that any patient would ever notice or would have any consequential effect on your life or your symptoms or your health. They might have caused a little bit more blood loss than they would have otherwise or gone a little slower than they would have liked. So anyway, that's when you know that if you've been utterly focused, not performing at your best, and sort of uncomfortable, then you know that you're in a very good spot. Now, that's not all that's required. We both know about the scaffolding research, right? So you can get even better healthy challenge if there's somebody there who can provide a set of challenges or tasks for you that will both help you be more focused in a useful way on like the next thing that's useful to focus on, but also they're helping you manage your frustration, right? Because that feeling of challenge is draining. And if somebody's not there to reframe that for you to say, hey, good job, you just failed at trying to do something really, really difficult, but you tried. If they're not there, then you're not going to have as healthy a challenge. So there's more to it. But humans, we are wired to avoid feeling uncomfortable. We don't like it. It's ironic that really what we need is to go exactly into that space where we just don't feel as competent as we would like.
I just at a conference and Dan Pink, he was giving a keynote and he was talking about this idea of subtracting things, make a to-don't list, because we often default to trying to solve a problem by adding things. And yes. I keep seeing that and thinking about that. I think that was like one of the suggestions as you're listing a bunch of questions to think about, like, is there a process that you can eliminate that's giving someone a bit more, you're creating challenge for them. And meanwhile, maybe you're also adhering to, if you attended Dan's keynote and now you're trying to create this to-don't list and you're trying to say, what are the things that I can subtract and take away and use that as my methodology for creating maybe a better solution. So I just had fun seeing that in there as well.
Right. Yes. It is funny how you realize we unintentionally get positive results all the time. And this isn't true just with respect to skill development and learning, but the difficulty involved in an organizational process, for instance, the friction associated with it. Bob Sutton, I'm a huge fan of his. He has a new book out called The Friction Project. He talks a lot about beneficial and counterproductive friction. And in some cases, processes and organizations that are no good, so to speak, I'm doing big air quotes around this, in fact, produce challenge that preserves skill in ways you don't intend. And should you keep it that way? No. But when you go around looking for efficiencies, again, this is big air quotes for you listeners, you will create in social science what's known as a second order effect, or economists call these negative externalities, where you fix a problem and you create a bigger one by fixing the problem, which really that is in a way the second third of the book that follows the skill code, which is saying we're fixing problems left and right with all these new technologies, creating great productivity boosts that many parties love, but we're creating unintentionally, in almost all cases I've found, a dramatic, existential, but very subtle negative externality or second order effect for learning.
See, that's just a beautiful segue. So we have to jump now to talking about like the threats and techno threats. I like that you use that terminology as well, as, you know, so many folks are being exposed to already dabbling, whether on their own individually or because of their boss and new tools, like something with AI or new technologies. And you said that this is not a doom and gloom book, but I do think it's worth us to address the threat of how this impacts our ability to develop skills.
Yeah, sure. And I think it is important to be quite clear and very serious. I don't mean like solemn, but very serious in acknowledging that I have now the threat I'll quickly describe in a moment. I have very strong evidence from over 30 different kinds of work, different kinds of organizations, different technologies that this is pervasive, global, and immediate. And especially true now with ChatGPT and the like. And the basic threat is intelligent technologies in particular allow an individual expert to solve problems with less help. They're self-serve. This was true with surgical robotics. It's been true with all the other technologies that I tend to study. That is great from the point of view of the expert because they can do more, better, faster, serve the people, solve the problems that they care about more. So they have a strong incentive to pick up the tool and get that productivity. Organizations also, managers, owners of capital love this. You invest in the tech, you get a boost. It might not always be the best. You have to figure out the kinks, as they say. But everyone who sort of has decision-making authority typically and resources to allocate is going to look at those decisions and say, hey, this is great. New tech boosts the productivity. And what, generally speaking, that does is it makes that expert more self-sufficient. And that means the novice who seeks to become that expert, or at least learn a little from them, is not going to have as much of a shot. This was pretty stark in robotic surgery. It was easier to see because the surgeon could do the whole procedure themselves with the robot instead of in a traditional procedure, you need 4 hands. So that resident during the surgical procedure was helping the whole time, had to be focused the whole time, learning, building neuronal connections, all 4.5 hours of a 4.5 hour procedure. Now they could just sit there and watch. At best, they're going to get 10 or 15 minutes worth of operating practice. And I've seen that repeated now ad nauseum, from investment banking to policing to bomb disposal to accounting to you name it, education. And there's no one party, I would say, aside from L&D professionals in organizations or people who are professionally responsible for the quality of the learning experience and skill development, who has a mandate and the professional skills and understanding to understand that problem and to own it and to fix it or address it. All the rest of the parties I just mentioned, leaders, managers, technologists, experts, are going to take that deal for productivity at the expense of novice involvement because they're not paying the immediate price and they can't even see it clearly. It's not a legible problem unless you've been professionally trained to understand the kinds of things that are loaded into that first third of the book, which means unless we do something about that, the 2.6 billion working adults who have to change between 10 and 40% of how they do what they do need to develop new skills. And we are kneecapping their ability to do that right at the moment when the globe needs to reskill the most. So to me, that's a huge, subtle, and I did the math, $1 trillion problem for the economy. And we must do something about it. And to cut to the chase, like I just wrote for my Substack maybe a month and a half ago, a post called Why L&D is Now the #1 Organizational Function. It's mission critical. Otherwise, organizations will just take a short run sugar boost, get their productivity, and find that the talent is not there 4 to 6 years from now to do their job.
Said so well. And it feels like L&D has been in the hot seat for a while. The time is now. Let's just segue a little bit into some of the solutions that you are suggesting. And you devote an entire chapter, but you hint at it throughout earlier in your book as well, the shadow learners. I have some thoughts or concerns about them. So maybe just giving a little context to who they are and why we can learn from them.
Great. And I want to learn from you. So I'll do a quick summary and then I want to hear what your concerns are about them, because frankly, I bet I share them. So the core finding in my dissertation in robotic surgery was that in spite of this block to novice participation that was so stark in robotic surgery, some novices or residents in this case were building skill remarkably quickly and very strong skill really fast. And they were doing so through practices that no one approved of. They were all viewed as slightly or seriously inappropriate, and thus the term shadow learning. In other words, there were folks who were building their skill through deviance, because deviance is what humans engage in when they're after a goal and there's no legitimate path to the goal that will work. That's like from the 1940s. That's a sociological finding. There's a whole set of magnificent studies that sort of show this across a variety of contexts. In a way, it's not a huge surprise that we should expect, if skill is something that humans value just intrinsically, that from self-determination theory that has like 2 million citations, that's just one of the 3 pillars of that theory. Humans strive for competence. So some will bend and break rules to get skill if following the rules doesn't work. If up close, though, if you look at those practices of surgeons and now seen it across many other contexts, it's not something you would ever recommend to anyone as an appropriate way to go about building skill, let alone for workforce development. Surgeons, for instance, that got really good, they operated on patients when the senior surgeon wasn't in the room, or found ways to rotate through services where that senior surgeon kind of knew a little bit less and therefore let the junior resident operate a lot because they might actually learn something in reverse, something I later turned into a paper on what I call inverted apprenticeships with a colleague, Callan Anthony from NYU. You don't write into your standard operating procedures that junior people should operate on a patient without senior supervision. It's not against the law, as far as I can tell, but it's certainly not viewed as an appropriate way to learn. What that discovery proved, though, is that there are people out there who are right now in your organization getting blocked to learn about new tech and how to make it valuable. And a scarce few of them are figuring new ways out to learn anyway. And you can look at their practices if you can uncover them, which is hard. But if you can, then you can say, okay, fine, this is inappropriate. You're building your skill. Good for you. How can we convert that practice into something that is appropriate and does recognize the new reality? Or are there barriers to learning that we can remove so that most folks don't have to do this kind of thing to get their skill? Like there's this combination of re-engineering what was there that was blocking, but also learning from this innovative practice and trying to do something effective out of it. That's really what the first third of the book is about, really. I mean, I was looking at those shadow learners saying, I can't write a book recommending people break and bend rules to build skill. I mean, that's just silly. What is it that they were fighting for to protect all of these shadow learners across all these contexts? That's the skill code. So it's a good sort of first pass, I think, at a healthy set of lessons to learn from folks who otherwise, you wouldn't want to copy.
In a nutshell, like I'm seeing that there's some riskiness involved, some non-compliance. Totally. I'm even thinking like personality, big 5 factor. If you're thinking about agreeableness, someone who's like, I'm hardwired to follow the rules, do
exactly
what I'm told, be compliant. I would never entertain this idea of deviance. Okay, what if you want to do it all? That person who's like, I'm going to be compliant, but I'm also going to find a way to take on some of these like deviant methods to obtain my goal, to get this skill development that I wouldn't otherwise get. That means that they're taking the onus on themselves.
Exactly.
Of course, in these podcast conversations, I'm like, that's not fair for the individual. There's an organization. We can't expect people to do that, even though you are talking about like kind of some self-directed learning in there. I'm like, it's not everyone can do that for sure. So what's the path of like what we take? Does L&D partner with some of these deviant folks and like find them and help kind of create a new path like you do with culture champions or like other initiatives? When you have this like one early adopter or someone who's an enthusiast, you kind of take advantage of them to help make the whole program that you're launching a success. I'm curious what your recommendation.
Precisely. Yes. Written a couple posts recently about the critical role for L&D. I have another one coming out. I would say I pulled together research across a variety of domains that shows basically whether it's deviant or not, some new technology washes up on your shores. There's always going to be people, groups who experiment early with or without permission. Like right now, 75% of working adults in the LinkedIn and Microsoft survey say that they use ChatGPT or its equivalent at work. The majority of those people are not supposed to be doing that. Therefore, they use their phones. In other words, they are deviant. They're everywhere. It is you. It is me. It is all of us. So L&D has the unique, and by the way, I should say executives also are critically responsible. And in fact, those two functions ideally should partner to make it a project, not to help individuals in the organization learn how to handle these new technologies, or not just to do that. That's very important, but also to learn from those individuals. The learning and development needs to be flowing in both directions at this point. The function, the executives need to make sure that before they come up with some strategy, or as they're coming up with it, they are informing it by direct, substantial, problem-oriented contact with people on the ground who are, sure, are they messy about it? Are they deviant about it? Are their successes partial? Are some of them creating harm and waste? Yes, 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 yes. But if you don't learn from the people who are literally months ahead of you, by the way, on what works and what doesn't, you're wasting time and effort. And it's also just disrespectful to the people who have sacrificed and taken little risks to learn things. And by the way, say, it is so stupid to try using ChatGPT over here. Oh my God, I wasted a month. And to give them space and to invite them into the conversation, to learn from them. I think that's absolutely essential. There's fantastic research, as you say, on how to run healthy experiments in organizations so that you learn rapidly about new tech or new opportunities, and how to integrate that into organizational operations in ways that build motivation for change. This is like Kotter's framework for organizational change. We know a lot about how to do this stuff. And who's the we here? Anybody who's gotten a proper MBA, so a leader, should know this stuff. They should know about what you do to rapidly learn at high quality when discontinuities arrive. But how do you build a system to support that mutual learning process over time in an organization? Who else is sitting in the organization? Folks go by different names: HR, OD, L&D. This is the moment for those folks who spent their entire career nerding out about how people learn in organizations, how to help organizations learn in productive, fast ways, things like appreciative inquiry. On this crowd, this podcast, that's a set of well-researched, validated techniques for learning from what's going right in an organization rapidly, and then prototyping how you could scale those successes elsewhere. Why reinvent the wheel? The people who know those tools, know those tactics, should be, in the ideal, a combination of the COO, CEO, CHRO, or CPO type, and the entire army of folks who've been waiting for this moment, sitting in talent management related functions in the organization.
Some of these recommendations you think will still protect that expert novice relationship that has lasted centuries, millions of years, whatever it is, in terms of building capability, building skills, that we don't have to forego technology, or that because technology has shifted so much that that whole expert and novice relationship sort of evolves into something new and different.
Yeah, I think that that's a very nice segue to the third of the book, which is about, this is not about somehow getting the toothpaste back in the tube. Like, let's get everybody back in the office, co-located, and have formal mentorships and do it the old-fashioned way. That's just not feasible. But it would be a huge loss, because the technologies that right now we are using in a way that compromises that natural, taken for granted learning process that happens at work just through collaboration across expertise levels could be used to dramatically enhance the quality of that learning process. So right now, there are many potential expert novice bonds that could enhance skill that aren't getting to happen because people aren't aware of each other. Or the project size is too small, quote unquote, to match people for that kind of a thing. Or there are people who are in different time zones, different organizations, different occupations, even, who could learn from each other. It's just too much complexity for a human being to design, to manage. But AI could really help with that. Mm-hmm. We haven't gotten really great proof of concept systems that could do that yet, but it's definitely possible. And I think it's necessary now so that we can enhance the human connection that drives learning, enhance our ability to contend with complexity because of technology. Like, literally the opposite story is kind of mandatory, I think. Using old tools to solve new problems, necessary, but not sufficient.
We're really running out of time, and I want to switch back to you, but I want to give you a chance to have like a closing thought. You are talking to those OD professionals, L&D professionals, talent development professionals, HR right now in this podcast. What's the next step? What's a thought?
My best, and I stand by it. It's now about a month and a half old, but I've now been talking fairly frequently with folks in this tribe, so to speak, and the recipe really resonates. So I'm just going to say, on my Substack, wildworldofwork.org, there's a post on there that says L&D is the new number one function. And by the way, I'm using that as a proxy for any function that is focused on human potential and human involvement in organizations. If you have a different name for yourself, fantastic. That just means you're culturally sensitive to your organizational context. But the basic recipe there is you yourself need to really understand what these tools are and what they're capable of in a very visceral way. I call it putting on your AI mask before giving it to others. And that's not just a quick tour of Copilot or what have you. That's necessary. I give a very specific, impossible challenge in that piece about trying to do something you never would have attempted before because you thought you didn't have the expertise. You wouldn't consider it, and have it be relevant to the business units that you serve. I got concrete in that piece. Let's say you support a sales function. Go get a phony or real. Phony is you can generate one if you have privacy concerns about the data of your company. A data set that represents a sales dashboard kind of data set for that area, and code up. I'm serious. If you have no coding experience, even better, code up a tool to analyze that data, run some analytics, and create a web-based dashboard to display your analysis to your internal client. Number one, that builds your credibility with them because you understand their business better. Of course, we all know that's critical to being a trusted business partner. But not only that, you will have raced ahead with this technology and have knowledge, skill with it in your bones, like what it's good for and also what it's really terrible for, that will be miles ahead of the people you serve in the business. You can be the AI thought leader, not just, oh, sure, it'll help you write a sales report that much faster, but now you can do things that are superhuman you never could have done before in your organization. And you can help them think strategically about how to create new opportunities. All of a sudden, you're a strategic asset. That phase zero, I think, and really doing it well is very important so that you can then turn to the business and say, hey, by the way, let me show you this learning problem you're inadvertently creating, the one we've been talking about, you and I now in this podcast. Like you're kneecapping the next generation of talent, no shade, but let's find out if that's really true and what we can do about it. That's problem one to solve. But the other one is, what could you dream to do now that you couldn't before? Normally, that's an executive function. Normally, that's a leader in an organization saying, let's think bigger. You're now the one who can say, do you have any idea, instead of just doing a faster report, what you could create, the value you could create in this world that you're not right now? Let me show you an experiment I ran. I created this thing. I didn't code before now, and it took me 3 days. You can be the leading light in the organization to say, not only do we need to learn from your people, set up a learning infrastructure, but let's dream about what's possible. All of a sudden, this is like breathing new life into the function as a critical igniter of new opportunities in the organization. I know I can hear some of your listeners going, okay, Matt, wow, you are a glass half full kind of guy. And I'm not unrealistic. In many cases, that's the full-blown, highly positive version of what's possible. But I also know that folks who come into people-oriented functions and organizations tend to want to add value in that way. And if you're down and cynical and feeling like a second-class citizen because all you do is compliance training, I hear you. But if there's ever going to be a moment where you are needed, the organization is blind to a critical problem in its infrastructure, in the way that it handles talent and cultivates people, you're the one to see it. Now is your moment. You have a huge opportunity, an upside to refresh your mandate and roll up your sleeves and start to add value. And you can pretty well trust that unless that executive has heard of Matt Beane or read his book or whatever, they're not going to notice this problem. And neither are the experts involved. They're all delightfully picking up ChatGPT to do more, better, faster. So this is your moment. That's what I'd say.
I do love that. As you had mentioned already before, it's some of the biggest issues, the kind of this perceived skills gap, skills crisis, and the convergence with AI and timing right now. I mean, probably exacerbated by AI, the skills gap, that the L&D function, all of our listeners should be empowered that they could be an AI thought leader, be upskilling themselves and modeling what that might look like for their organization while still protecting how you develop and build capacities, the skill code, and not losing that expert and novice relationship. I know we could keep talking about this forever and ever. We're going to start to wrap up. We're going to talk about your learning goals. So what are you working on next? How are you continuing to push yourself out of your comfort zone?
I am, as of last week, the CEO of a startup called SkillBench. We're building technology that I'm putting my entire sort of life energy, aside from being a good husband and family member, behind building the very technology. You go ahead, read chapter 9 in this book. I talk about a technology. Wouldn't it be nice if we had infrastructure that did the following? That's what we're building. And so I can't talk about the details of it right now, but soon I will. And I've been in a startup before, but never been a CEO, never a founder. And it's a lot. I'm learning a lot, but it seems very clearly necessary. And I swear, I've been writing about the need for a system like the one we're building since my Harvard Business Review article, at least in 2019. But before then, too, 2015, and nobody's built it. And it does genuinely seem necessary. So I have put a lot of my responsibilities as a researcher and as a teaching professor on as much hold as I can for the next couple of years to charge after, yes, helping get this book out to folks so that they can do their own empowered work locally to solve their problems, but also to build something that can give them a tool so that they can really amplify their efforts. That's my next mission.
Practicing what you preach. And how can our listeners keep up with you and your activities?
So the first thing to say is that if you want the first chapter of the book for free, go straight to accidentaltrainer.theskillcodebook.com, and there it will be waiting for you. You can go grab it. That's one way to sort of keep in touch. If you want the full set of materials about what I'm up to and get access to the Substack that I've mentioned, you can just go to theskillcodebook.com, and there you'll find the Substack. You'll find ways to get the book, details on what I'm up to, that kind of thing. So probably those two things put together. But first, if you're interested, go grab that chapter.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Very generous to share with the ATD community. And I'm sure folks will be typing that in as they're listening right now or when they get to a computer. This has been a great conversation, Matt. Good luck with SkillBench project. I'm looking forward to digging into your Substack as well.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to our sponsor, Overdrive.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.